Hi, grandkids. I know it's been a few days since I did a chapter. So I'm on chapter 5 of Where the Lilies Bloom. Wildcrafting is a sight easier to read about than do, as we all found out during the days that came then. It is not an occupation for the squeamish ones or for those who like to lie abed mornings, or for anyone with weak feet or unwilling legs. Viewed from a distance, Sugar Boy's blue-tinted countenance spread up and out, joining the outlying wilderness in a smooth, benevolent sweep. Under the movement of the sun and the drifting fogs and the streaming winds, it appeared strong and silently kind, but this wild and lonely primeval rock held its deceits. Its untracked trails sometimes slid steeply downward to dark, lifeless chasms, tumbled thick with razor-sharp boulders. Beside an icy waterfall, there was a cave which most surely had harbored a large black animal. It had left behind bits of coarse hair and a strong scent. Within a dense stand of yellow birch trees, we came upon a timber rattlesnake coiled in a puddle of sunlight. It reared its evil head and sounded its hair-raising warning, and Imogene screamed, and Romy, who had brought along Roy Luther's gun, blew its head off. Dark birds wildly rocked in the sudden ground gusts that pervaded the upper slopes. A swarm of yellow jackets drove us from a wide, luxuriant spread of Galax, and Imogene muttered darkly over this loss. Galax was not listed in our wildcrafting book of medicine plant, but Mr. McConnell's want list stated that the glossy, heart-shaped leaves were in demand by the florists in town. We had come that morning to gather pollen, a tedious, back-breaking process for the brightly colored dust that had first to be shaken from the plant stems and then sifted through a fine cloth. Romy complained that working with it made him sneeze, and asked what was it used for anyway. And I said to make medicine for people who had hay fever and other allergies. And he said we should have been born mountain goats instead of humans, and sneezed into his pan and got a face covered with yellow floral dust. This was a day of days. We weren't looking for the golden seal, but we found it, hidden deep within a laurel thicket, shining dark green beneath its canopy of shade. Romy was sure it was ginseng, and screeched out that we were rich, and ran back to the wagon for the Wildcrafter's book, and came back with it, and we knelt and studied the picture plate and the verbal description. "It's ginseng," whispered Romy. "We're rich. Oh, Mary call." I said, "No, I don't think it's that. I don't think it's ginseng. I think it's golden seal. See these berries? Don't they look like raspberries? And look at the leaves. They're hairy. Look at the picture and compare it with the plants. They're alike. This is golden seal, Romy. I'm sure of it." "Golden seal," whispered Romy. "We're rich. Mr. Connell wants the roots and the leaves too. Look what a mess of it there is." "We'll buy a car," said Imogene. "And all the candy we can eat," said Devola, some yellow shoes. "A bumblebee just stung me on my ankle," Mary called, "but it doesn't hurt a bit, not one bit." Romy threw himself backward on the ground, and in an ecstasy of silent joy pumped his legs. Then, after a minute, he started to laugh, and Imogene did too, and they became obsessed with their laughter and kept it at it so long that I had to make them stop. The golden seal roots came out of the ground, moist and juicy, beautifully yellow in color. Romy said, "What were they used for?" And we consulted the book again and read that golden seal is used in dyes to make healing salves. We carried a basketful of the roots and leaves home and spread them out on an old sheet to slowly dry. Every 4 hours, Romy turned them, although the book didn't specifically say to do this. Gathered around the lamplight, we talked about how we'd spend the money. I said, $10 has to go into the money box right off. That comes first. Imogene said a car was all she wanted, and Romy said he'd like a book. Devola said she had changed her mind about the yellow shoes, that whatever her share was, she'd give it to Roy Luther. She didn't say what she wanted him to have. I went in and sat beside Roy Luther for a while that night. I held his hand, so dry and frail, and talked to him. "If you're doing any worrying about us, Roy Luther, you can stop. Today I took Romy and Imogene, and we went up the mountain and found a big bed of golden seal. The roots alone are worth dollars a pound, and the leaves are worth something too. So we earned a sizable sum today, and there's more. We only worked about half of the bed today." Roy Luther breathed, and his good eye, incredibly blue, quested my face. The light glimmered on his few white hairs. "We forgot to reseed. The book said all good wild crafters reseed. If they didn't do this, pretty soon all the medicine plants would die out, and there wouldn't be any more. We'll do this next time we go. I had a talk with Kaiser Pease, Roy Luther. He's given us this land and this house. He had me write it out on a piece of paper, and he signed it and gave it to me." Well, we know the truth about that one. So now, the way I've got it figured, we're in good shape. With the money we earn from wild crafting, I aim to lay in enough supplies to last us the winter through, and come next spring we'll plant and work the land. Kaiser has already said he'd lend us his tractor and give us the use of his horses. And I was thinking we might even fix his house up a bit, or this house up a bit. Paint some and see about getting us hot water so we wouldn't have to always have to be heating it on the stove for dishes and our baths and all. Oh, Roy Luther, I do feel good about things tonight. All of us do. You feel better, don't you? You look like you do. Devola said you ate good today. Tomorrow we'll take the golden seal to Mr. Connell and get paid for it. He'll take it even though it isn't dried. Devola wants to buy you a present, but she doesn't know what. I wonder what you'd like." Roy Luther's eyes had closed. He was asleep. I put his hand back under the coverlet and sat beside him for another minute more, just watching him breathe. The life in him is too soft now, I thought. It will go before the spring comes. Mr. Connell acted like it made him happy to open his cash register and lay the money for the golden seal roots and leaves in my hand. He said, "What were we going to do with it?" And I handed him my supply list. Imogene, who had promised to be good and not wheedle for things impossible, left my side and tiptoed over to the jewelry counter, and with real longing showing in her face, gazed at a tray of gold and ruby rings. Romy went to her and took her by the hand and drew her to the front of the store. They stood in front of the soft drink box for several minutes, seriously debating. Finally they decided, and Romy put the money I had given him in the slot, lifted the lid, and took the drinks out. Romy uncapped them, and they carried them outside and sat on the wicker bench there and happily drank. Mr. Connell weighed pinto beans and cornmeal, and as he filled my list, ticked off each item with his pencil. "How's your daddy, Mary Call?" "He's some better, thank you." Mr. Connell leaned down and got an empty cardboard carton from beneath the counter and started setting the packaged supplies in it. Mrs. Connell and I've been meaning to drive out to pay him a little visit. How are you going to get this stuff home? You got Romy's wagon outside? Yes, sir. Mr. Connell had made a trip to one of the back shelves and came back with 2 cans of half peaches. A present from me to you, he said, stowing them in the carton. You don't have to thank me. It ain't anything. A couple of cans of peaches ain't anything. I said, thank you, Mr. Connell. Roy Luther will enjoy them. I'll tell them you sent them and that you wanted to come and pay him a visit, but just haven't had the time. It's all right. He'll understand. He doesn't care much for visitors anyway. You know how it is when you're sick. Visitors'll wear you out if you let them. Mr. Connell glanced toward the curtained door that separated his door from his living quarters. He spread the supply list flat on the counter and with the heel of his hand smoothed it. Yes, I know how it is when I'm sick. I just want people to let me alone, but they come anyway. I told Mrs. Connell that Roy Luther probably wouldn't be wanting any company, but she'll be wanting me to drive her out to your place this evening or the next, so you can just be on the lookout for us. He took his pencil from behind his ear, licked the point of it, tore a strip of paper off from the roll at his elbow, and began figuring out how much I owed him. We didn't get away without seeing Mrs. Connell. At the last minute she came from behind the curtain, and with the interest so alive in her eyes, but trying to hide it, and her slow wax smile, asked first about Devola and then Roy Luther. Said that it was her baking day and that she'd save a loaf of her oatmeal bread to bring out that evening or the next. On his way to put the box of groceries in the wagon for me, Mr. Connell waddled past and said for Mrs. Connell to put a few candies in a bag for Imogene and Romy. She picked out the gummiest ones and followed me outside and with a little appraising flourish handed the bag to Imogene. She said, "Goodness, Imogene, you look like a little rag picker. Your daddy should be ashamed of himself letting you come to the store looking like that." I was proud of my little sister then. With a grave, sweet look, she accepted the candy and said thank you and didn't offer any excuse for her canvas shoes, which were threadbare across the toes, or her outgrown dress. Mr. Connell put the box of foodstuffs in the wagon, and Romy turned it around and said he was ready to go if Imogene and I were, and Mr. Connell straightened and gave me one clear look, and I went across and tried to take the handle of the wagon from Romy, but he wouldn't let me have it. On the homeward trek, Imogene threw the candy away. It was old and dirty, she explained. Nobody could have eaten it. The air was warm and alive with birdsong, but sweeping down through the warmth and the sun was a colder underlying breath, very faint, just the taste of approaching frost in it, but still unmistakably there, and I said to Romy that we should hurry. He said, "No, we've got all day, Mary Call." He didn't understand me. I didn't mean that we had to hurry for that day. I meant for the days to come, the harsh winter ones that lay ahead. It is so hard for me to write this next because it's about Roy Luther's leaving us. I don't know how it happened or at what hour. I only knew that when I went into him first thing the next morning, he had gone. There was a congealed redness in his wide open, unseeing eyes, and he was already cold and a little stiff. With a corner of his sheet, I pressed his eyes closed and turned him to the wall, arranged the covering over him so it would look like he was merely sleeping, and then went out and told the others that they were not to go into his room that day, not for anything. Devola did not question this, nor did I Medine. They ate their eggs and hoe cake and asked were we going to Wildcraft that day. I said no, and they got out 2 buckets and said, well then, they just go burying, and went out the back way and swung off down the valley in the brightening morning gloom. Left behind, Romy pestered me about Roy Luther, saying why couldn't anybody go in to see him, and why did I have his door closed, and wasn't I even going to give him his bath, and why were we wasting the whole day? There wasn't a thing wrong with it, and what the Sam Hill was wrong with my face so clenched that all of a sudden it looked like it was about 100 years old, and was I just going to sit around staring at the wall all morning? I looked at him and I thought, oh Lord, you sure made a mistake when you put me together. You didn't give me enough strength to carry out all I'm supposed to do. I can't do this by myself. You can see that. So now I've got to break a promise. I said, Romy, Roy Luther is dead. The sun striking through the windows fell across his face, and it twisted, and his eyes ceased their questionings and became so still, and he said, oh, Mary Call. No carrying on now, I said. That's one of the things I promised him, that there wouldn't be any carrying on. So if you feel like doing anything, don't let me see you at it. You hear me, Romy? Pale within his suddenly glistening face, his lips moved. Yes, Mary Call, I hear you. Tonight he'll have to be buried. There's a place waiting for him upon old Joshua. Roy Luther laid it out and dug it himself months ago. We're not to call the undertaker or the preacher. We're to do this by ourselves and keep it to ourselves. You understand me, Romy? His eyes, so thrust with pain and stricken, went to the wall beyond my head. The others, he whispered. Aren't we even going to tell the others? I said, not just now. Maybe later on in the day. It wouldn't be right to keep it from them, he said, and slid from his chair and went outside and stood motionless in the sun for a long minute, and then took off running out across the fields. Ah, I felt sorry for him, and for him then, this little brother, having to take half of this cold, terrible thing and do his mourning all alone in silence. She's not even thinking about herself, poor girl. Throughout all of that day we moved, he and I, in a frozen, unreal style, pretending to the others to relish the berry cobbler on the noon table, more education from the root and herb book, the plans for the money we were going to make. Afternoon dinner, Romy built a fire under the iron pot in the backyard. Devola and I washed clothes. Imogene said that with the money we were going to make from our roots and herbs, maybe we could buy a washing machine, one like in the Sears catalog, and maybe an electric lamp for the sitting room. She said she didn't like the oil lamps we used, that they smoked. Romy said, don't fuss so much, Imogene. Electricity costs too much. That's why we don't use it more. They quarreled, and I had to stop them. Devola used the soapy water left over from the clothes to wash the kitchen floor and the back porch, and sang while she was doing it. Twice she thought to ask me if I had bathed Roy Luther and attended to his other needs, and I said yes. One by one the hours stroked by. It turned late afternoon, and Romy, half sick with dread for what lay ahead, but still holding remarkably steady, got me to one side and asked me why we were keeping it from the others. I told him because when something is finished, it's easier to look back on. He said, when were we going to tell them? And I said, tomorrow, but after that, nobody else. Not anybody else was to be told, not Kaiser Pease, or Mr. or Mrs. Connell, or anyone, because if they found out, the county people would come and take us to rear. Possibly they'd send us to an orphanage, and we wouldn't be a family anymore. For supper, Devola cooked cranberry beans with ham hock and made baking powder biscuits and opened a can of peaches, or a can of the peaches. I took a tray into Roy Luther's room and forced myself to eat what was on it. I sat beside him and tried to think words of prayer, but none would come. The body under the sheet seemed smaller, looked like it had shrunk more just since that morning, and I wondered how much it would weigh, and thought about how we would have to tie it to the wagon with a rope, unless Romy could be persuaded to walk alongside and hold it steady with his hand. From early lesson in mortality, I thought of Roy Luther saying that there would never be any understanding of death, that it was beyond people's notions and ideas, and meant to be that way. Forgotten was the threatened visit from Mr. and Mrs. Connell. They came just as the last supper dish was being wiped. Mrs. Connell stepped from their car like some spindly bird, pausing to examine the daisy beds and the patches of wild green fern clumped along the walkway, but her interest was not with them at all, but with us, sniffing away at our privacy and our freedom. Mr. Connell followed her up the steps and proffered their offering, 2 loaves of homemade oatmeal bread. I invited them into our sitting room, and Mrs. Connell drew her skirts before she lowered herself into Cosby Luther's rocker. Roy Luther is asleep, I said, and I hope you don't mind if I don't wake him. Since his fall, he sleeps poorly at night. Mr. Connell said, "Ula, let the man have his rest. We shouldn't have come. I told Mrs. Connell that we shouldn't, but she wanted the ride." Devola came in and crossed over to me and leaned down and whispered to me, should she offer them tea or something. Mrs. Connell smoothed her gingham arms and smiled at all of us and said, "Oh dear, no, we couldn't take a thing, thank you. We can't stay. But just a minute more. You have a crack in your ceiling, Mary Call." I said, Yes'm, it just came. Roy Luther's been intending to fix it, but he's just been so busy. He'll get around to it in a couple of days. Mrs. Connell rocked and ironed her skirt with her hands. I must say that I commend your father, Mary Call, keeping you children together the way he has, and never asking for a bit of outside help. Fussing with her skirt, straightening it, she looked across the room to Romy and Imogene. But pride goeth before a fall. There might come a time when he'll be glad to ask for some help. Mr. Connell said, "Olive, for heaven's sake." Mrs. Connell stood. She tucked her hands inside her loose sleeves. "Well, we'd better be going. You're sure Roy Luther's asleep, Mary Call? If he's even just half awake, I'd like to see him just for a minute. Just a word of encouragement sometimes helps enormously, you know." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Romy move to lay a hand on Imogene's chair. I said, "Yes, he's sound asleep, and I daren't try to waken him now." Mr. Connell said, "Well, we'll be getting on then," and stood and ushered Mrs. Connell out before him. They went past Roy Luther's closed door and out to their car and got in and drove off. Night had fallen, and it was time to bury Roy Luther.